That's the periodic table of elements. I can date my introduction to science by that. It's wonderful, really. It's the universe at its essence. You see, you have your alkali metals, you have your halogens, your inert gases. Every element has its place in that order. You can't change that. They're secure, no matter what.
You're not married?
Me? No. I'm not very good with people. All right, I never have been, Leonard. I like them. I wish I could say I had more than a rudimentary understanding of them. Maybe if they were less unpredictable.
Wait a minute. Dr. Sayer just described me. Although, Leonard, I am married. Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Cinema Psych Podcast, the podcast where psychology meets film. I am your host, Dr. Alex Swan, and today we are going to be talking about a really feel-good, but also kind of, this makes me sad kind of movies. Yeah, we're talking drama in this episode, and that drama is a really great performance from both Robert De Niro and Robin Williams. Yep, I am talking about the 1990 classic Awakenings. That's the film that we're going to be talking about on this episode. And I've got a great guest host to help me talk about this episode. But before we get into that, if you're not familiar with the movie, and that's totally fine too, there's not a lot of spoilage that I could do to this movie. I mean, it's based on a true story, and we'll get into that true story in the episode. So, stay tuned for that. But like I said, Robert De Niro, Robin Williams, equal billing. This is, one of Robin Williams' first, I think it's his first appearance as a doctor, as a real doctor, or at least based on a doctor, because then he goes on later in that decade to play Patch Adams. So this is the first go around as Dr. Robin Williams, and then Robert De Niro plays a wonderful, he did a lot of, he does method acting, basically. I don't know how much method acting he does these days, but in some of his truly groundbreaking performances, like Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver, and, his Don Corleone in Godfather 2, and in this one, in Awakenings, he really gets into the role. That's how he preps for them. And in this one, it's very difficult to tell. As an outsider, admittedly, as an outsider, it's very difficult to tell that he does not suffer from tremors and other catatonia issues that we'll talk about later in the episode. It's hard to tell that he doesn't have those issues. But of course he doesn't. He's playing somebody with these neurological issues. But you got to give it up to him. He does a really good job showing the arc of his character, somebody who is dealing with this illness, with this neurological disorder that leaves him catatonic, awakening from that, hence the name of the movie, and then. The saddest part of the movie is that it's temporary. It's a temporary situation. But this is the movie itself, Awakenings, based on the novel of the same name. And that the writer of that novel is Oliver Sacks. We'll talk more about Oliver Sacks here when my guest host jumps in. But yeah, so the movie came out in 1990, directed by Penny Marshall. You know, she's one of the great directors. Some of your 80s and 90s classics, I tell you what. In addition to De Niro and Williams, Julie Kavner, voice of Marge Simpson, plays the love interest for Robin Williams' character. John Hurd's in it, his second film of 1990. Who would have thought about that? And then a few other random people. Alice Drummond, great character actress. Anne Mira. George Martin, like these are wonderful, wonderful character actors who came and did these Awakenings roles. So yeah, I'm excited to talk about this movie because there's not just one thing to talk about it. Yeah, we're going to spend a lot of time with the neurological part of it, but there are other things, and I'm going to try to make sure that we don't have like a 6-hour episode here. So without further ado, let's just jump into it. My guest host today is Dr. Sarah Bagley. She is an associate professor of psychology at Lindenwood University in St. Charles, Missouri. Hey, that's just around the corner. Has been full-time teaching since receiving her Ph.D. in 2012. Her area of expertise is behavioral neuroscience, perfect for this discussion, but teaches classes in research, statistics, learning, memory, and sensation and perception. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me today. Being on a podcast is quite new to me, so I'm really excited for us to have this conversation.
I am excited too, and I'm so glad that you can do your first podcast with me. That's always fun because then now you'll be a pro at it when you go on to the bigger and better podcasts. So like I do with all of my guest hosts when we get started is first, how was your spring?
Oh, quite different and unusual. We were teaching in a high flex form, so I was not only in the classroom with my students, but also live streaming and recording videos, and students had lots of wonderful accommodating options, most of which chose to not be in the classroom with me. So it was different, but luckily in good health, and most of my students said they enjoyed what they were learning from my classes. So different. Hopefully the fall will resume more into kind of normal classroom, everydays and interactions. But thanks for asking.
Yeah, I wanted to get a sense of how you ended the semester, since a lot of us are. It is only early June as we're recording this, and a lot of people do listen to these as soon as they do come out. So I wanted to get a sense from you about what a roller coaster of a year it was.
It was quite a roller coaster. The first time I had ever taught online was 2 summers ago, an online introduction to psychology class, and then that was not one of the classes I taught in this last very pivoted year. But currently this summer, I'm teaching it again. So I have used a lot of my online teaching knowledge from 2 years in the last year and transformed some things for my summer class. So we're about
silver linings.
Yeah, we're about 3 weeks into my 6-week class. So we're doing good.
Nice. Excellent. Well, let's pivot to film here. And so broadly speaking, before we get into Awakenings, I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on films and movies as a general fan and as a psychology instructor. What makes you use film in your teaching?
I love using film, but I try not to overdo it. So in recent years, I tried to maybe assign 1 movie per semester in a class, just to make sure that my students have the accessibility to watch the movie and connect deeply with those topics. And as we're going to talk about today with Awakenings, there's a lot you can connect with. So I try and be really choosy on the films, but I have taught an entire class on memory and the media. Yeah. So
Awesome.
some class, or in that class, we would go through about 5 films in a semester and really dive deep into those. So I love using it as a very different kind of tool that's not just out of your textbook or interacting with the professor or interacting with other students. It just gives a different Hollywood way with hopefully amazingly portrayed characters who can give you a glimpse into life from a different vantage point.
Yeah, and would you say that it mirrors your general like of film?
Oh yeah.
You're just a student of life, and you like to go and do those things, and then share that with your students.
Oh, for sure.
Uh,
And better,
I love that.
and even better, my students inform me of movies or shows that I would enjoy just by the nature of what we're doing in the classroom.
And that's when you know you've made it as a teacher, when you get through to the student and they come immediately back to you and say, "Hey, look, I just applied what you said and I saw it somewhere else."
Absolutely.
That is wonderful. So let's pivot again. I guess maybe we're doing 180 degrees now. Let's pivot to awakenings. So, as a behavioral neuroscientist, I can imagine why you chose this film. But for the listeners, what made you choose Awakenings for our discussion today?
Well, actually, Awakenings is a movie that I remember from my childhood. So I remember being in my teenage years and watching this film. And I did not realize at the time that, number one, I would ever even go into psychology as a field, or maybe it started my fascination with the brain. I think my fascination was much earlier than that period of time. But I I was very much aware of this movie, and I won't be the one to say that I was the first one to bring it in my classroom, because it was actually another instructor who said, "This is a really great movie for physiological psych," the class I was
Wow,
teaching at
yeah.
that time. And I was like,
Nice.
wonderful. Not only could I connect it from what I had experienced in my formative years, but it's just an endearing story with a wonderful cast. Robin
Mhm.
Williams, Robert De Niro, they just knock it out of the park
They
in
do.
just their portrayal. And I didn't realize until my graduate school years that this was based on a true story. I had always just thought it was a romanticized film of a life that I hope I would never necessarily lead.
Mhm.
So having Dr. Oliver Sacks, this British neuroscientist or neurologist, so in practice, he actually,
Yeah.
in some of his speakings, talked about how he tried to do laboratory research and he was not cut out for it. So he went into the clinical field and
Yeah.
he was able to have a breakthrough with these patients who were awakened from their persistent vegetative states with this drug identified during that time, the 1960s, called L-Dopa.
Mhm.
So this story is not only about the awakening of these patients, that's heartwarming, gives you the warm feels. Some students
Yeah,
tell
it
me
does.
it's a little bit sad too. I get that phrase
Yeah.
sometimes a lot. So warning. But it also awakens my students to the ideas of neuroscience in a historical context,
Yep.
ideas about humanity, and some of the physiological underpinnings of what's going on inside our body with that biology. So I've been
Yeah.
using this film for almost a decade. I guess we've been doing that about nine years in my upper level classes of either physiological psychology or behavioral neuroscience.
That is so awesome. I love that. That it first came from a suggestion from somebody else, and then you were like, "Wait, I used to watch that when I was a teenager." And then as we'll discuss, like, just the wealth of information that you can share with students about, "Oh, this is one thing, and this is another thing that happened, and here's hey, look, they're talking about L-Dopa. Let's look at what's happening in the brain while this is going on. I am saddened by the fact that I kept putting it off. This was my first viewing as I prepared for our chat today, and I only watched it a few days ago. So it's fresh in my mind, and I kept putting it off. I knew it was out there. I knew it was about psychology. I knew it was about neuroscience and clinical neuroscience. But I kept putting it off because I was like, well, it's probably going to be sad.
Oh, and really? That would be what you were expecting?
Yeah, but that was the first thing, and then of course it was. So I knew it. And then the other thing that I was every time it popped up on my watch radar, I just wasn't in the mood for a drama.
But it's not only a drama. You have these moments of hilariousness.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right, and I didn't give it a fair chance. I will say, like, synopsis writers really need to jazz up some of these movies because it doesn't feel like 2 hours. There are some parts that do drag, I will be honest, but it doesn't feel like a 2-hour movie. Like, it gets you set up for it, and of course, Robin Williams pulls you in, and he plays a fictionalized version of Oliver Sacks. But I gotta say, I was looking at me in like 20 years.
You turned British?
I mean, I am...
That's one thing.
Exactly. No, not Oliver Sacks, but Richard Sayer, Robin Williams' character. And just his mannerisms and his just inability to have good conversations. Even what I thought was hilarious, and you've probably seen so many nuance in over the last 9 or 10 years of using this movie, but just the fact that he can't even have a good conversation with a catatonic patient. I mean, he was me. I was looking at myself watching this movie, so he immediately sucked me in. And the parts of the movie that dealt with giving the L-Dopa to the patients, that was compelling, from both ooh, that's unethical, but ooh, that's amazing. So, and we'll get into all of that. But Sarah, why don't you give our listeners a sort of historical background into the movie and who this Oliver Sacks guy that we keep mentioning is.
Okay, so this movie highlights the experiences of Dr. Oliver Sacks, who was, like I mentioned earlier, a neurologist who came over from Oxford into New York in the 1960s. And so Dr. Sacks is a fictional character based on, Dr. Sayer was the fictional character based on Dr. Oliver Sacks.
Right.
So the book that he published over this experience of all of the clinical patients, while this movie really only focuses on Leonard, he had numerous patients that he was working with throughout his time in this clinical ward. So he published the book in 1973, and then the film came to fruition in 1990. And what this whole experience is chronicling is the epidemic of encephalitis lethargica. So that is going to be the inflammation of the brain. It was also known as the sleeping sickness from about 1917 through 1928. They are uncertain on the origin, so they don't know if it came from bacteria or a virus or what type of inflammation these people had, but it was a worldwide epidemic. It was worldwide.
Wow.
It started in Europe, and then this was obviously in the United States. So it impacted in one of the publishings of Dr. Oliver Sacks, said it impacted about 5 million people and killed what they expected was an estimated 1.6 million people. So this was quite an epidemic, or pandemic. I'm not sure how far in the world it went, but it was actually hard to know when people were experiencing the effects lingering from this leaking sickness, what it was, what was actually occurring in the brain. And then the story from Oliver Sacks really develops from those patients who survived.
Those patients who survived, and a subset of them had this other kind of
Yes.
disorder, right?
I from my research, I think it's a majority. I mean,
A majority, okay.
We've learned so much in the last year with the COVID-19 epidemic. And what we have seen from that is people could have the virus and have absolutely no symptoms. So it might have been possible, and the technology is by far different in the last 100 years from when this epidemic had started. So it's really hard to know how many people were affected, how many fully recovered, how many had those lasting impacts. But what they did see in the chronicles of these people who had this inflammation in the brain, survived it, was it's interesting because they call it sort of a Parkinson's type tremor and some Parkinson's dementia and a lot of rigidity. And to the point that these patients would go to sort of a vegetative state. So we can get more into that in just a few moments.
Yeah. So the character of Leonard is shown at the beginning of the movie playing with his friends, but then having difficulty writing his name in cursive. And that's a through line through the entire film. Probably a dramatized version of it, of this character's desire to write his name in cursive. And then it fast forwards to 1969, where we meet Robin Williams, Dr. Sayer, and he's sort of sort of a caricature of Oliver Sacks, but in like in a not a derogatory way, kind of like a fictionalized version of some of his, I would say, Dr. Oliver Sacks's quirks.
If you have ever, I would suggest Googling this at some point. Dr. Oliver Sacks is a funny individual, where he said that
I know. Yeah.
He actually, Robin Williams did such a great job. Sometimes Oliver Sacks didn't know if he was portraying Robin Williams or himself, because he did such a great job of figuring out his mannerisms and how he could interact with these patients or have, and so I often wonder, because I have watched many videos of Dr. Sacks, the late Dr. Sacks, and I do wonder how much of that was actually dramatized versus maybe he had those moments.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. And they were both hairy. And the shocking thing about their two lives is that Sacks only died a few short months after Robin Williams died by suicide. So very interconnected individuals on two completely different paths that sort of intertwine at this one moment and then come back again and intertwine at the end. It's sort of outside of the scope of the movie, but like very mystical, very strange.
Yeah. I had read somewhere, and my source memory is terrible, but that Robin Williams said this was actually one of his favorite characters to play or portray.
Yeah. I'm not sure who did say that, but it's on the IMDb trivia, because I read that last night as I was going through the trivia for this movie on IMDb. So yeah, he has said that it was one of his favorite films of his. And I really would like to know where it ranks on Robert De Niro's list, to be honest, because he's done a lot of method acting in his career, and he's played a lot of interesting characters. Travis Bickle probably being the biggest icon of his career, but he had to do a lot for this movie. He had to be rigid and catatonic, and then he had to play all variations in between just fully functioning, like every space in between that.
Which
It was so good.
I'm sure as an actor just stretches your ability so much, but I can understand how it would not be easy to do. So I wonder that as well.
Yeah. It's very, very, very interesting to think about, and this is the kind of thing that I do think about when I watch, non-disabled people do this kind of work, and you kind of think about, okay, how much time did they put in to doing this? Who did they study? Who did they talk to? That sort of thing. It would be very interesting to learn how Robert De Niro went through that. I don't know if he's ever said anything. If anybody can link me to an interview he's given on that, I would love to know.
That would be great. I mean, just speaking about that, it reminds me of Claire Danes playing Temple Grandin in her video, because, I mean, she does things quite spot on. So, I mean, props to those amazing actors and actresses who can step out of their comfort zone and try something different from perspective taking. I'm all about perspective.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Okay, so they have this. They had this disorder. This illness is actually encephalitis, and many of them were catatonic for many years. There's an older woman who thinks that it's 1926. Leonard doesn't realize that he's an old man until he looks in the mirror. There's a lot going on, but then another character has a wife and children, but they're grown. The wife moved on, and he was sad about that, and so there was a lot of different perspectives in that. But they all had this illness, and then they all had this idiopathic disorder, which was they couldn't figure out what it was. A lot of atypical ... And Robin Williams as Dr. Sayer tells Eleanor, the love interest of his story, tells her, you would think with all of these atypical cases that there would be atypical. And I thought that was great, because that's how averages work, right? So
right, absolutely.
I thought that was a great line, and they all have this disorder, which causes them to be rigid, but operate in some rather remarkable ways. What are some of those ways that they operate before the treatment?
Well, interestingly enough, I think Dr. Sayer says, capturing the motion of other things in the environment.
Her name is Lucy Fishman. She was found by neighbors with her sister several days after her sister died. She has no other living relatives, and they say she has always been as she is now, with no response or comprehension. And yet...
a reflex.
If she batted it away, I might call it a reflex. But she didn't. As you can see, she caught it.
Still a reflex, Doctor.
I'm sorry. If you're right, I would agree with you. It's as if, having lost all will of her own in which to act, she borrows the will of the ball.
The will of the ball?
Excuse me.
You're trying to make a good impression, right, Doctor? Trying to make a good impression. That's it, isn't it? You're still settling in. Miss Costello, will you see to it that Dr. Sayer's patients that are waiting outside are rescheduled for tomorrow?
Yes, sir.
Borrows the will of the ball. That's great. Okay. Thanks. Thank you. Okay. Let us know if she catches anything else.
So he can set them to motion with music, or Lucy who gets stuck with a pattern on the floor. So it's almost as if these brain systems are able to function at some level, but it's more in cortical processing rather than awareness. Awareness rather than wakefulness. So I wanted to mention this. I talk about this in a few of my classes. When we think about consciousness in general, it's sort of two different dimensions. How physiologically awake are we with our bodies? Are we eyes open? Are we able to move our bodies? Are we able to really be at that high level of alert? And, that ranges throughout a whole day, from when you're sleepy and yawning in the morning to when you're at your peak performance. And it goes on the spectrum. And the other level is awareness. How aware are you of your environment? And it sounds like these patients are not having the connection between these two dimensions. Maybe there is this slight bit of awareness, such as the tile pattern on the floor, but they're not able to have them both operating on this high level of awareness and wakefulness. So it's interesting because they're categorized as vegetables, right? They're said they're in the garden where they are only going to water and feed these patients. It's a sad portrayal of some history of patients with mental health issues. But vegetative states. So a true definition of vegetative state means that you have that physiological arousal in the body, but disconnect that from anything awareness with the environment. Now, that's different than being in a coma where there is no awareness, there is no known arousal. And then another kind of medical classification known as minimally conscious, where you can connect your low levels of arousal and awareness. So it's interesting thinking about consciousness in these two sort of dimensions, and where these patients, can they actually know what's going on or not? And then what are they able to do with their bodies at those point in time? So it sounds like, they were in like a dreamlike state for all of these years.
Right.
And maybe they could shuffle on the floor, but not be connected to a deeper level of awareness of their environment.
And it's striking. There is a handful of scenes that sort of connect loosely to one another, sort of thematic, before Sayers sort of has his breakthrough. Which was they were talking about he was talking with John Hurd's character, who I only assume is like the chief medical officer or chief of medicine or something like that at this hospital. He's having a conversation with him, and he says, there's hopefully nothing going on in their minds, because, I mean, how awful is that alternative? And that, I think, really sticks with Sayers' character, or Robin Williams' character Sayer. And he's trying to have this breakthrough with, the motion therapy that they first started with, trying to get them to do sort of activities based on, some sort of input. And he gives him a Ouija board, and he tries to have him spell his name, but Leonard's moving the whatever it's called to different letters, and he spells out Rilke and Panther. And at first, when I saw it written out, I was like, okay, I see Panther, but turns out Rilke is an author, and wrote about a panther stuck in a cage, and Robin Williams reads a quote of that while staring at a panther pacing back and forth.
His gaze, from staring through the bars, has grown so weary that it can take in nothing more. For him, it is as though there were 1,000 bars, and behind the 1,000 bars, no world. As he paces in cramped circles, over and over. His powerful strides are like a ritual dance around a center where a great will stands paralyzed. At times, the curtains of the eye lift without a sound, and a shape enters, slips through the tightened silence of the shoulders, reaches the heart, and dies.
He could get very close to that panther. I thought that was very strange. I'm not entirely sure where this panther was, if it only existed in his mind, but he seemed really close to a panther that was within touching distance. But he sort of gets that. He's like, wait a minute, they're in there, and they've been in prison. They've been in mind prison.
Could you even imagine?
It sounds. This was the first time. That was the first time that I was just like, sort of took my breath away. Like, wow. It's one of those things that's hard to take perspective.
I mean, think about this. This is the 1960s. They don't have functional brain imaging. Fast forward to 2009, 2006, there is a group of researchers, Owen and Monty, they have a lot of published work now, where they are doing functional brain imaging with patients in vegetative states. And they would...
No,
have
I
you
have
heard about
not.
this at all? Oh my God, it's fascinating. And I mean, Hollywood has taken this research, and I just saw in the latest couple episodes of Grey's Anatomy.
No.
Yes, I do watch that.
My wife
I'm
does
sorry.
too.
But I mean, in the most recent episodes, they're taking Owen and Monty's work, and they're portraying it in this Hollywood way. So think about this gap between the 1960s, where you can't see activation in the brain based on, just utilizing glucose at higher levels. What Owen and Monty and some other colleagues did was they took a couple of patients. They started with one, right, a clinical case, and had them functionally dissociate brain region activity of either imagine someone was playing tennis versus imagine walking around the rooms of your house. And these will activate two very different brain regions, and they would ask the patient questions. And if the question was yes, you could do something like imagine they're playing tennis. And if the question answer was no, imagine walking around the room. And I mean, it took a while to unpack the answers, but some of these patients who were classified as being in vegetative states where they were not aware of their surroundings could answer appropriately to those questions.
Wow.
So, I mean, while it may be a different disease, now we have a different way of connecting or trying to understand if there is some sort of awareness for a locked-in syndrome or something of this vegetative state, something of this nature, minimally conscious. Yeah. So, I mean, I love this. I get to talk to my students about
this.
That's
awesome.
Like we're going, 60 years into the future, and we're still trying to figure out how to communicate if there is that ability to communicate with these kind of patients.
Well, in a situation where they can't communicate directly with you, I could see that this could work too with, nonverbal autism spectrum individuals.
Yeah.
That's really cool. I had, like I said, I had not heard about this, and I don't pay enough attention to when Grey's Anatomy is on to know that they...
I wouldn't take your I mean, they don't quote those studies or anything of that
really
nature.
Should.
Knowing about the study.
They really should. I think they can dramatize it.
Knowing about the study, I was like, oh my goodness, they're talking about Owen.
I know. You honestly have to know. This is where you really get to test your research muscles on this, because you gotta flex when you know what they're talking about. I think that's hilarious.
And this is exactly why my husband will not watch that show with me, because he'll be like, your basal ganglia, what? Like, can you just stop talking about the brain for a while? Okay.
I love it. Okay, so I want to talk about the big L-Dopa thing, but we're going to take a quick break before we jump into all of the brain talk. So, get a snack, get buckled in. We'll be right back with that discussion. Hey, listener. Thanks for sticking around this episode. I hope you're enjoying it. Anyway, I need your help in growing this podcast's audience. In past episodes, I've asked you to share this podcast with 5 of your friends. Let's keep doing that. Share this podcast on social media, especially if you really liked an episode. Share that episode. Tell 5 of your friends or family if they have an interest in film or psychology, or even better, both. Growing the audience is our goal for the second year of programming, and so we need your help to get that done. Other ways to contribute to the podcast include tips to our PayPal, found on our website, becoming a patron at patreon.com/cinemapsychpod, rocking some sweet merch from our Spreadshirt shop, and or leaving us a rating or review on your favorite podcast service. Now back to the show. Okay, so we are back with Dr. Sarah Bagley talking about the film Awakenings, again, starring Robin Williams and Robert De Niro in some of their best performances that I've ever seen of them, and I've seen a lot of their performances. So what I want to do with this next segment, Sarah, is I want to talk about this L-Dopa, which is the main sort of driver of the story and the plot of the movie, and really has a lot for, your psychophys classes or your behavioral neuro classes, and that is this L-Dopa thing. So if you could, as the behavioral neuroscientists on the call here, could you tell us what L-Dopa is, what dopamine is, and what you mentioned earlier, the basal ganglia? What's that?
Okay. So, for all of you naive scientists out there or neuroscientists out there, let's start with the brain, right? That's where it all starts. It's that lumpy, connected tissue inside your skull, and your brain and your spinal cord are connected through neural communication. And sitting right, if you were to take your hand and hold a fist, imagine your arm attached is your spinal cord, and then it comes just at the base of your neck would be your wrist, and then it bulges out. Now, this would be your hindbrain or brain stem. And if you put your other hand right over top of your fist, that's going to be your cortical area surrounding your brain stem. So now you all have kind of a visual representation or a tactile representation of what your brain is. And all of your sensory information is bringing information in through your brain stem, through your spinal cord up to your brain stem, usually out into the cortical areas. If you need some sort of movement to occur with your body, your cortical areas will tell your brainstem to send information down the spinal cord and then tell your body to move those muscles.
Yeah.
All right. This does it kind of without fail. Our bodies are so well equipped to do this. The basal ganglia is a special region in the brain stem, so that kind of first fist I gave you, that helps us refine motor movements. And by refine, it's going to allow us to enhance our motor movements. So thinking about holding a bat to hit a ball, you are going to be able to hold the bat steady and swing at the appropriate time, given information coming in. It also, it helps us initiate that movement to swing the bat at the right time, but it also helps us inhibit other motor movements so that we are specifically talking to only specific muscles to make that happen, and we're not swinging the bat all over the place, okay? So the basal ganglia does 2 different functions. It initiates and it inhibits. And one of the main neurochemicals that we utilize specifically in this area is dopamine. And dopamine will work, depending on the pathway, to initiate movements or inhibit movements. And I'm just kind of talking about in the basal ganglia. Dopamine does a lot of things throughout the whole brain as well as throughout the whole body. you can do a quick search and learn that it's one of the neurochemicals that allows addiction to happen and is very, very highly tolerant and all this good stuff. So what we think was happening in these patients' brain with sleeping sickness is that there was a deficit in this dopamine where it's not allowing them to initiate motor movements. And you also see with some of the tics and the tremors in the early signs of these patients that they're not able to control the muscle groups that they want to control. And it's very, very similar to a Parkinson's type disease that has deficits in the basal ganglia with some dopaminergic functionality. So when Dr. Sayer, or Dr. Sachs in real life, goes to this conference and learns about L-Dopa, he thought, well, maybe this area of the brain, I don't know if they knew specifically this area or that it could be involved, if there's an agonist, meaning if there's a dopamine dysfunction where these neurons are either not producing enough or not able to receive dopamine, L-Dopa can work to provide more dopamine into that system, where then the system can maybe work more appropriately.
Yeah.
Right? So in general, that's what L-Dopa is. It's called an agonist of the dopamine system. And it will allow someone who maybe had either this executing muscle function issue or controlling or inhibiting these other muscle functions, all controlled by the brain. So it allows the sort of resetting of those abilities. So you see them awaken and be able to control their movements again.
Yeah, and I think what I'll add to that was a great description, and a bunch of awesome. I think I'm gonna steal the baseball bat idea. That's a really good example. But I think it's also important to note that L-Dopa is not only a which is what they call in the movie is a synthetic drug. But it's also a precursor to a lot of other neurotransmitters in your brain, not only dopamine, but other what are called catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, or if for those of you who like to take the British idea and warp it into the media, the American media, then adrenaline. You can have adrenaline and noradrenaline. Yeah. Because we need multiple names for everything. That just makes sense. Just confuse people. Yeah, it's great. But anyways, I did want to mention that even though in the movie they characterize it as this synthetic material, that it is made by our body from amino acids. Right? You got to get that protein in your diet so you can make L-Dopa. Then you can make dopamine. It's been great. So the idea is that you flood the system with L-Dopa, and then that will get metabolized into, I guess maybe not metabolized is probably not the right word. Synthesized. Yeah, there we go. Synthesized into dopamine for use by the other systems like the basal ganglia, as you said. And so in the movie, and there are parallels to what happened in real life, and then there are not. Then there are the fictionalized versions of this. So I have a rant, but before I get into the rant, I want Sarah to because I learned this TIL this stuff with Dr. Saxton, the actual things, because I have not read the book Awakenings. And so I did not know any of this. So Sarah, what actually happened? And then we'll talk about the portrayal.
So my research upon this is that they had originally received a 90-day trial and with permission, consent from the families, for a whole group of these patients to receive L-Dopa. And it was double blinded, meaning the doctors and the patients or caregivers who gave consent were not informed as to whether they were going to get L-Dopa or the placebo. So Dr. Sachs speaks about being able to infer with almost certainty each of the patients who received L-Dopa within a month or less. So this was supposed to go 90 days, 3 months-ish. At about a month or less, they completely stopped the trial and gave all patients L-Dopa without that 90-day limit. So they also believed that was going to be unfair to stop seeing this progression at 90 days. And I have a quote from Oliver Sacks in 1983. Thus, what was originally conceived as a 90-day experiment was transformed instead into a historical experience, which I think is an amazing way to perceive what you had just done with these patients. So he actually had a hard time getting his work published in traditional academic journals and reported feeling bewilderment, frustration, anger, despair because he wanted to disseminate this story. And how Dr. Saxon, if you've read any of his other works, Man Mistook His Wife for a Hat or Musicphilia or Hallucinations, they really are stories. And not peer-reviewed published articles with tables and charts. And no, he tells the story of these individuals. So he was finally able to get his work published with more essay form rather than scientific peer-reviewed. And that became his much preferred way to be a doctor treating patients rather than a scientist.
Right.
So I want to hear your rants about his non-scientific method.
I'm not going to rant about Dr. Sachs. What I am going to rant about is the portrayal of it in the movie, which not necessarily grinds my gears, but it's just like, oh man, I hope people don't believe that this is what, doctors were doing even in 1969, because they probably weren't. But in any case, that is not what happens in the movie. All of that history that Sarah just gave you listeners is not at all. Well, maybe there's a little bit, but nothing of that nature happens in the movie. Okay, so he goes. So Sayer, Robin Williams, goes to the conference and learns about L-Dopa. And he learns about L-Dopa based on apparently one person's work. You don't really see too much of any other kind of research. This guy played by Peter Stormare, which I thought was an interesting choice for like 2 minutes of screen time. He's not that collegial. He calls himself a chemist. You're the doctor. And I was like, whoa. You can still help him out. Like, don't have to be a jerk about it. And then he takes this single idea with no white paper. I know that would not be at all cinematic to write up, a précis on what L-Dopa could do. But he goes to the chief of medicine. He's like, hey, I found this drug idea. You've heard of L-Dopa, right? Because you're a physician. And the guy's like, yeah, I have, but you don't have a lot of evidence. And he's like, yeah, okay, but, it still might work. Chief of medicine's like, well, what do you want to do? Give it to all of them? Yeah. No. Some of them? No. One of them. I was like, okay, well, it's no longer an experiment anymore. It's a case study. Yeah. Okay, fine. Case studies are valid or fine. As long as, you document and do all your stuff. It's fine. Okay. And then he's like, I know exactly who I'm going to give it to.
Yeah.
Okay.
The one I think
it's going to work on. Talk about confirmation bias.
Which is exactly what a researcher should do.
So, fast forward to him giving it to Leonard, and we see their titration attempts. So titration is starting somebody at a low dose and bringing them up incrementally to much higher doses, or you can also titrate downward, going from a high dose and bringing somebody down to a low dose. So it's just basically not giving somebody an entire bunch of toxic chemicals all at once. But the movie doesn't do a very good job of passing time. And so what ends up happening is you're like, all of this titration is happening over and over and over again. Sayer's going to the pharmacy and looking at a pharmacist or chemist or somebody, put 400 milligrams of L-Dopa into a drink. Doesn't seem to work with orange juice, but we don't know if it was the orange juice's fault or what, right? We don't know if it was the citric acid inside the orange juice that inactivated it, or if it just was too low of a dose. It's confound there. But they switch it to milk. Great. Good job. You didn't really actually rule out the confound there. But okay, that's fine. Put it in milk. So they put it in milk, and then you see them over and over again increase it, and nothing's happening. So they're like, oh, nothing's happening. And what we know now, okay, again, as you've mentioned, Sarah, this is the 1960s. But, drug therapy wasn't necessarily like, we don't know what we're doing.
No, they knew what titration was.
They knew what they were doing. They knew how this would work, and I would imagine that with a couple of decades of psychotic medication work under their belts, they would realize that it does take a little bit longer for psychoactive substances to start working in a brain. And we know now, a physician will tell you, here's your SSRI. Hey, it's not going to work right away. It's probably going to take up to 4 weeks. So give it a shot, give it a chance, right? And so they're like, it's not, I'm tapping my watch here. It's not going fast enough. And so, in the evening, when it seems like he was not supposed to do this, because the pharmacist was like, hey, bro, don't touch my stuff. And he goes into the pharmacy, pulls out the L-Dopa, puts a freaking gram of L-Dopa into some milk and gives it to Leonard. Dude was juiced up on L-Dopa. No wonder he got up.
No wonder. He's wired for the day.
Wired. And the crazy thing about it was that completely was forgotten. It was ignored. He never said anything like, hey, should we give these people this amount? No, it's more like a gram.
No.
It's more like a gram per dose. Wait, how do you gram? Last time we did it was 500 milligrams. Don't worry about it. It's just a gram.
Don't worry about it.
Just thinking that we should double the dose. And it is completely ignored swept under the rug. It worked. But you're at a friggin' hospital, man. Come on. You are a doctor.
I know, but the 1960s, and I wasn't alive during that time, so I can only speculate. It was a different time. And, we're going to say this was a lot of Hollywood, and we can say it was unethical, and a lot of, it's got to be the portrayal that they want for this story. And I'm not trying to justify it, but I am trying to justify it. I mean, we also, as a medical community, as a scientific community, experiences like this, we're supposed to be having conversations that he did not do this right. Like, this is unethical. They didn't have permission in this way. They should have gone back and gotten consent, or, have a governing body like an institutional review board, which are very, very prominent in universities and hospitors. So because of circumstances like this, where people bend the rules.
No, you are exactly right. It is instances like that. Fictionalized instances, bear in mind, though, because this doesn't reflect what actually happened. Would not have been dramatic or cinematic in any way. But of course, you need to have this. Exactly. You need to have this air of like, I have to do something. Something has to work for you to get that glimmer of hope that you see in the second half of the movie with all of these patients.
And I think piggybacking off of that, in this character of Leonard, there is this Hollywood dramatization of a romantic relationship, and I could find no record of that actually being truth. So it's based on a
Right.
true story, but that part was not true.
Yeah, I guess there are only a few stories that would, if you changed them, it would be worse than what actually happened because they are that
Mhm.
larger than life. But most of these sort of medically sort of oriented, medically based true life stories don't have the same dramatic quality to them. Yeah.
Kapow. I want to call it
Yeah,
kapow.
exactly. Some bang, woo, boom,
Bang.
that
Whiz
sort of
bang.
thing. Even though I will say that learning about the actual sax stuff today, reading your notes, they do what I would consider ethical thing, even though they break the rules, quote unquote, by ending the trial early. It was the ethical thing to do because they immediately could see what L-Dopa was
Absolutely.
doing. And when you have
Yeah.
an obligation
And
to
it's
help, you have to fulfill that obligation.
Yeah. And I think that's what Dr. Oliver Sacks's comment was of being a clinician and treating his patients and the
Mhm.
people rather than the disease or the disorder. And you kind of have to question it in today's day and age in regards to vaccine use for, that's non-FDA approved for emergency use only. Like there are instances when you have to weigh, and this is where humanity and morality, you try and really get the best ethical equation for that moment. And you hopefully have a lot of experts being able to weigh that input. And in this film, the only expert is Dr. Sayer, and he just goes and gives him that gram and he wakes up happy as a clam. Now, in reality, if his basal ganglia in the whole dopaminergic system is coming online, he is going to have a lot of tics. You could equate it to someone who is under the influence of cocaine or even some amphetamines. Like he's going to have some nervous qualities just in the activation of that system. He's not going to just sit up and be like, "Oh, happy day."
Yeah. I think it might have been a little shocking had he woken up that way in the movie, because I think it makes the impact of the tolerance to L-Dopa and the spasms and the tics that develop.
Yes.
Yes. Now, one thing that I wanted to ask you specifically with this system, and I don't know if this is true or not, which knowing this is true would help me describe this later, but they conflate the I guess tolerance building with Leonard getting upset. And I'm curious if they did that for dramatic effect or if there's something in the arousal of him leading to those tics.
So if you look up the L-Dopa tolerance, it's actually quite common for patients to get agitated, to start having some paranoias or delusions of grandeur, which he was doing. Like he was getting upset because everybody needed to listen to him, and he was the one in the room and trying to tell people what to do. Yes, there is a little dramatization. But it could also have been possible that when his body was building the tolerance, meaning he's getting that same level of L-Dopa, so now his system is used to getting that level of dopamine, it's not activating in the same way. Tolerance means you need either more of it or the body just can't handle it in that way. So absolutely, it does fall in line with how someone could be building up that tolerance and the side effects from it. So the agitation is out, absolutely. Yeah, it's quite possible.
How are you today?
I'm all right. How are you?
Never better.
What's the purpose of these gentlemen?
These gentlemen protect me.
I wish I didn't need them.
Someone's trying to hurt you? Who?
That's the thing, isn't it? Who? One never knows. Someone I least expect. I expect. Look at history.
Leonard, every patient on this ward thinks there's a plot against him.
Yeah, well, they're mistaken. They're crazy.
You've gotten worse. The drug's not working. All these things you're experiencing are the side effects of that, and they're making you behave this way.
I appreciate you coming to see me, but I have things to do.
Leonard, please look at yourself.
Now, look at yourself. I have sickness. Sickness took me out of the world, and I fought to come back. I fought for 30 years. 30 years. And I'm still fighting. But you have no excuse.
Nothing to do with me.
You have no excuse. You're just a scared and lonely man with nothing. No life, nothing. You're the ones to sleep.
Your medicine could be taken away. They can do that. You could wake up in the morning and it won't be there.
And so would you say then that this has a lot of connections with the symptoms that you would see in schizophrenia? Because one of the hypotheses with schizophrenia is overactive dopamine, right? And so you have more dopamine than you need. And so you end up seeing agitation, paranoia, hallucinations, all the side effects that you just mentioned. So it's an interesting connection.
It is an interesting connection. So I used to actually work with patients with schizophrenia quite a while ago. I was a data coordinator in a psychiatric research lab, and they were looking at metabolic effects and not cognitive effects, even though we were measuring those as well. And I just, every time, because I have students ask about schizophrenia all of the time, it is the most interesting and unable to pinpoint one exact reason or one exact kind of combination. I mean, it's such an interesting disease that I would say possibly, like, that is a possible theory. And I mean, it's still not known. I mean, clearly L-Dopa might be a possible supplemental treatment in order to, or not L-Dopa, and that is a treatment. I'm backtracking on what I just said, but looking at the dopaminergic system, it is most certainly plausible that a deficit there, or even overactivation, could lead to those types of positive symptoms for patients with schizophrenia. But if you think back to this movie, these patients were identified as having atypical schizophrenia, or at least some of them, because they were exhibiting the negative symptoms. So the blank affect, the inability to move, or rigidity in movement. So there is connections in multiple ways with schizophrenia to the patients with the encephalitis lethargica, but doesn't mean that one is causing the other. There's also various inflammation questions when it comes to schizophrenia, and it's a whole lot to unpack.
They're almost like two mirror disorders. One, you have too much dopamine, and one you don't. And of course, Parkinson's being the one that we know more about with respect to dopamine and the basal ganglia, and use of L-Dopa in that treatment. In treatment of Parkinson's is what I wanted to say. So it's a bummer too, because the end of the movie, they all end up going back to where they started. So they were awakened. And then they
yes and no.
go back to sleep.
Yeah, but they had the experience.
Yes.
And maybe this is where I feel like an eternal optimist. Would you rather have the experience or never have the experience? I don't know. I also, knowing more about the history, while it's noted that summer, these patients had the most vivid recollections of being awake and aware, they all gained tolerance and reverted at some point.
Right.
They would periodically administer L-Dopa and seeing some lasting success of very shortened awakenings. But Leonard, who the story is based off of, he lived another 12 years. So he died in 1981, and he had small periods of awakenings.
That's really awesome. And probably because of the continued L-Dopa administration. I wonder if they had not, if they had stopped treatment based on side effects or something like that, that recording smaller windows of awakenings would not have been observed. So it is this whole L-Dopa thing that really runs the show.
Yeah. Which is so cool, because in my classes, especially a class like behavioral neuroscience, we get into the level of understanding neurons, understanding neuron or brain chemistry, these different brain or neurotransmitters like dopamine, some drugs, and how they work in the brain and all over the brain. And we talk about movement systems, and we talk about sensation and perception, and we talk about levels of consciousness. And I'm not giving a sad plug for my class. I'm just saying, like, this wonderful movie ties so much together.
It does.
In historical context, and is able to just make you question almost your own humanity. Any of us could have been exposed to a virus and
right, exactly,
go to sleep for 30 years.
Exactly. And you have convinced me, because I am going to be using this this film for the first time in this coming year. I'm going to be teaching cognitive neuroscience, and this is the film that I've already chosen, sort of 8 months, 9 months into the future, or however 6 months in the future, when we start in January. Yeah. So we're definitely going to talk about this one. So you've sold me on this one, of course. And I think everyone will be better off for it. And I'm really hoping that we can watch it in person.
Oh, yes.
Everyone watching
pause halfway through and say, what do you think what else is going to happen in this story? Yes,
because we have had we have had a previous conversation, I mean, with another group of people, but you were on the podcast actually on an episode that was released earlier this week. You joined us for the Midwestern Psych Association's annual meeting at a roundtable for the podcast, which was virtual because of COVID. But you had talked about how you engage your students in this sort of like discussion based practice where you stop the movie halfway.
Yes.
And ask them how it's going to go. And I can't wait to do it, because I will have a couple of films, in the fall too. So I will be doing that as well.
And, I was thinking about it in a virtual world. And if we're not all watching it together, you can also have them turn in like a 1-page reflection paper, or, an idea of a reflection paper of where do you think it's going to go? Pause the movie at this exact time. And
exactly.
Tell me what you think is going to happen. And then you guys can have conversations of that. Mm-hmm. And then what really happened when everybody comes together.
Yeah. So I'm pretty sure, with the way things are going, knock on wood, that we will be back. Most people will be back, if not all people will be back by the spring for sure. I'm thinking fall too, and I hope the same goes for you all where you're at.
Fingers crossed.
It's time for the Your Thoughts segment of this episode. Yeah, it's back again after a little bit of a hiatus. So we're talking awakenings. And of course, I like asking other instructors who didn't get a chance to join me to talk about the film what they would talk about if they were to use or have used this film in the past in their teaching. So fellow instructors, what did you have to say? Joshua Bluestein would talk about the book. He would talk about the book and spend a lot more time on Oliver Sacks himself. Rachel Blasseman, I hope I am pronouncing that correctly, used the film in a seminar class to discuss the nature of consciousness and reality monitoring. A little bit of what we discussed in this episode as well. Sheila Kennison refers to the neurobiological psych stuff when talking about drug tolerance, which is really, a big part of why L-Dopa fails. The case described in the book, could have come, as she says, from the 1918 flu, which I think is an interesting connection. I don't know what overall the research says on that, but seems like an interesting connection. There is definitely a correlation, a coincidence in timing there. Schlomit Fleischer Grinberg, I hope I said that correctly, does use it in psychopharmacology, talking about L-Dopa, of course, and neurobiology, the encephalitis part of this disorder, the encephalitis lethargica. Jason Spiegelman, friend of the pod, jumped in and says what I think is a really great explanation for the phenomenon shown in the film. He calls it the Goldilocks phenomenon of dopamine. Too much, you have psychotic symptoms. Too little, you have neuromotor symptoms. But just right, you have neither of those symptoms. And he also talks about the difficulty of treating other conditions without eliciting symptoms of the other, which is what Sarah and I had discussed with Leonard and irritability and things like that. Karina Malavanti also chimed in and said that ethics and caregiver family dynamics, right? The mother, we don't talk a lot about the mother in this podcast episode, but there is a lot to discuss with the relationship of Leonard to his mother. And Esther Chang rounds us out here with neurotransmitters, and that is L-Dopa, dopamine, and all the rest. If you want to participate in any of these Your Thoughts segments, just drop us a line on Facebook or Twitter and join in the conversation. Thanks for listening to this. Now back to the show. Before we finish on the film, I do want to end on a slightly lighter note, since we kind of ended on a dour note that, the awakening didn't last. There were small glimmers of it as time went on, but it didn't really last the way that you kind of would hope for in an ideal world, right? So, Sarah, what is your favorite scene or collection of scenes in the movie?
Oh, that's such a great question. As I think back, I've seen this movie so many times I probably couldn't even count it at this point. The last scene is always delightful when they talk about the real awakening being the caregivers of these individuals. But I would say what actually trumps that is Lucy and the pattern on the floor and connecting how she is moving. And that light bulb moment when they have, drawn in the black squares on the floor and they get her to that moment at the window where it wasn't necessarily the will of the black. There's some sensation perception in there. So like the black and white, that it's not that's drawing her. It's the window. and the awakening and the ability
Mm-hmm.
to see outside. And I just think that that is just a powerful moment to go, or to think to yourself, treatment of people. We need nature. We need the ability to have that freedom to look out a window. So I don't know. I get goosebumps when I think about how powerful that is in regards to the treatment of any sort of patients, and how routinely the mentally challenged individual have not had those kinds of access to outside space to even be able to look out the window. They're usually just in beds with medical machines. And when it comes to cognitive
Right.
states, that can't be healthy for anybody. Even if you were in a great
No.
mental state, it's not going to improve your well-being. So I just think that that is so important when you start thinking about clinical facilities or long-term care facilities. Yeah. And I'm glad you asked that question, because I had never actually voiced that out loud before right now.
Yes, that's what I love. This podcast. This is great. I love it. My favorite scene. Well, it's a collection of scenes. So Bradley Whitford plays an early role, like has like what 2 lines or something like that, which I think is kind of amazing for an actor of his ability. Got to stop somewhere. He and another guy play 2 other doctors at this hospital, and they seem sort of like they are real jerks. That's what their characters are. But they're kind of weaselly, kind of um anti science, because they don't really care what Dr. Sayer ends up figuring out about these patients. They don't really care, and I don't even see them have any like uh turnabout activity like the nurses do, and the other caregivers, like Anthony. But it's a collection of scenes. So the first scene is when the 2 doctors and the chief of medicine are with Dr. Sayer, and he's showing them what happens when you chuck a ball at these patients, and that they catch them, and that it's they're capturing the will of the object. And the 2 doctors are like, no, you're so stupid, this is so dumb, and then they walk out snickering to each other or whatever. And then later on, Sayer is doing some EEG recordings of Leonard, and he's trying to ask him questions and see what sort of brain activity changes when he asks general questions versus personal questions, and nothing seems to be changing on the printout of the EEG. And then he takes the sheet of paper to these 2 doctors, and they're eating lunch, and he says to them, "Hey, look, this is the EEG of these people. Notice anything?" And they're like, "Yeah, this is the same as it ever was. No activity or barely any activity or whatever." And then he flips the page over, and there's this like burst of activity on the EEG, and he's like, "This is where I said his name." Mic drop, and then he walks away. He leaves the EEG there, and he walks away. That was an amazing moment of comeuppance for those guys, and a boost of confidence for is a very anxious character in Dr. Sayer. So that is my favorite. I really enjoyed that. So
It's like,
I'm glad we could explore those 2 scenes.
I feel like
collections of scenes.
you're a person who roots for the underdog. And so I think in your enjoyment of that scene, you were like, yes, he just stuck it to him. Yes.
Yeah, of course. Exactly. I love it. I love it. Well, I want to thank Dr. Sarah Bagley for joining me to discuss Awakenings. Before we say goodbye, Sarah, is there anything that you have going on you'd like to, talk about, plug? And if there's any place that you'd like to share your work or
Well,
about you?
I mean, I'm not really overzealous on social media, but I think you could probably find some of my publications on LinkedIn, or even on my Lindenwood University faculty website. But
Okay, I will link that.
But I really appreciate you inviting me on your podcast. This has been a whole lot of fun on a
This was fun.
very endearing movie for me and something I get to share with my students. So I'm glad that I have won you over in this film, as well as any listeners out there as well. So thank you for having this platform.
You bet. This was great, and this is why I like having this platform. And so that is going to do it for this episode. Until the next one, thanks for listening.